Hi everyone and welcome back. Today we're going to turn our attention to the idea of parole and discuss what happens when an individual is allowed to complete the remainder of his or her incarceration sentence while living in the community. Remember from earlier in the semester when we discussed the idea of probation and parole. These are two distinctly different concepts. What we are discussing today is a community-based sanction, much like probation, but that is connected to an already existing incarceration sentence. Probation is not connected to incarceration at all. Let's go ahead and get started. So traditionally, the way the parole works is that an individual must be found guilty or must plead guilty at the trial court level. The judge then sentences the defendant to an indeterminate sentence involving a range of prison time, meaning that the defendant received 5 to 10 years for committing a certain type of felony offense, for example. After 5 years, the inmate reaches the first instance in which he or she can be eligible for parole based on the amount of time already served. Primarily, parole is only a state-level option anymore. The federal government has eliminated parole, but if you were sentenced early enough, then it may be an option for you. But it is few and far between for federal inmates. So what things are taken into account when making a parole decision? Things like family background, race, ethnicity, and nationality, nature of the criminal offense, number of criminal accomplices, nature and length of sentence, length of time served before parole, whether a defendant accepted a plea bargain or not, trial recommendations for leniency on the defendant, prior criminal record, and the infraction record while in prison. Based on all of these factors, the inmate may be released from prison on parole at the time of their hearing. This is called discretionary parole release. The parole board is not required to release the inmate. The inmate is only entitled to a parole hearing. If the inmate is released, then there are a number of things that he or she must do while on parole in order to remain in good standing with the court. So again, if the sentence is a 5 to 10 year prison sentence and that inmate is released after the first 5 years, then he or she is required to serve the remaining 5 years of that incarceration sentence while on parole. If the parolee does not comply with his or her parole conditions, then most likely they will be sent back to prison to serve out the remainder of that 5-year sentence. Parole officers have some leeway and discretion, much like probation officers do, but it is likely that this will happen. If the parole officer tells the court that the parolee has violated his or her parole conditions, and the court sends the parolee back to prison, this is considered parole revocation. Back to prison you go, and you will serve out the remainder of your prison sentence there. Just like with probationers, we mentioned that parolees will need to abide by similar conditions. This typically always means maintaining or seeking employment. It could mean some sort of therapy or treatment with a mental health provider. It could mean drug abuse treatment for drug offenders, making sure that they're not using illegal substances, and that they're providing clean drug tests. They may not be able to be in contact with victims or with co-defendants, and they have to show that they're turning their lives around. This means no contact with other felons or gang members, for instance. These things all suggest to the courts that the inmate is serious about doing the right and legal thing once they are released from prison on parole. They're getting their life together, they're working to stay out of trouble, and that it was not a mistake to release me on parole. We have already briefly discussed discretionary parole release once before in this lecture. As a refresher, this is not a mandatory form of release and is contingent on the inmate's behavior while in prison. What has he or she done to improve themselves or to reform themselves while incarcerated, and whether this individual would be a good candidate for parole. The parole board will make a decision as to whether or not the parole would be granted at this time. This is used with indeterminate sentencing structures. With mandatory parole, it is much more often used in determinate sentencing or truth in sentencing states. This means that after an obligatory number of years, the inmate will be released on parole once their parole formula has been met, while taking into account good time credits. If the inmate reaches the required time served, normally this means 85% or more of the sentence, but has no good time credits because he or she has been a disciplinary problem, then he or she will not be released on parole. The inmate may be required to serve the entire sentence. When we are talking about the decision makers, the parole board members, they are really tasked with making sure that the inmate in question would make a good parolee. The parole board has to make sure that the inmate is eligible for parole release based on the time already served, the length of their sentence, and whether the inmate has met the minimum requirements for release. Most of this is done using a parole formula for release, so it's one of the more easier aspects of the job. The parole board and parole officers are overseeing those inmates once they are released on parole. They want to be sure that the parolee is transitioning well back into the community, that they're reconnecting with a support group, that they're finding a job, and doing all of the other things that the parolee needs to be doing to make sure that reentry is successful. Sometimes they have to determine whether or not the parolee would even be capable of reintegrating back into society at the time of their release. If the parolee is messing up on the outside, then the parole board does have the authority to revocate the parolee and bring them back to prison. Not only is parole used as a way to cut down on incarceration costs, but it is also used as a way to help alleviate prison overcrowding in some areas. If a prison is getting too packed, then low-level, non-violent felony offenders are typically the first ones to be paroled. This allows for more beds and more cells to open up, and it alleviates some of the overcrowding. When we're discussing those who are on parole, we're looking at quite a few people here. 1 in every 351 adults in the United States is currently on parole supervision. But still, that's not as many who are currently incarcerated, as roughly 1 in 110 individuals are currently incarcerated in either a jail or a prison in the United States. And if you look at the criminal justice system and criminal justice supervision of any kind, that ratio quickly becomes 1 in every 32 adults in the U.S. Typically, the average parolee is a man. The number of white and African American parolees is pretty similar, about 41% for white individuals and 39% for black individuals. In terms of parole sentence length, it frequently exceeds more than a year. It is not uncommon for some parolees to be on parole for 5 or more years at a time. Federally, the situation surrounding parole is much different than it used to be. Parole began in the federal system in 1910, and the parole board consisted of internal actors who would make the decision on specific inmates. The prison's warden, physician, and the superintendent of prisons would make a determination. The thought was that the warden and the physician would know the inmate best, since they would be around the individual quite frequently. They would know what the inmate did while in prison and if that individual was ready for parole release. You also served a lot less of a sentence back in 1910. If you were sentenced to more than a year in prison and you served at least 33% of that sentence, you would be paroled. Life in prison allowed for parole release after 15 years. So a much different structure than what we use today. In 1930, a formal nationwide parole board was created for the federal system. Federal parole was an option all the way through 1984 when the Reagan administration passed the Comprehensive Crime Control Act. Among other things, this act created the United States Sentencing Commission, established federal sentencing guidelines, and essentially eliminated indeterminate sentencing structures for the federal system, thus eliminating federal parole. However, there was some grandfathering that took place. Even though the act was passed in 1984, it did not go into effect until 1987. So, if you were sentenced on October 31st, 1987 or earlier, you were eligible for parole at the federal level. Any time after that, and parole was no longer an option for those inmates. Currently, there are still inmates in the federal system who are eligible for parole. They haven't been granted release yet, but they are still technically eligible. So until the last parole eligible inmate is either released or passes away while still incarcerated, then federal parole still technically exists. So how well do our parolees do on the outside? The answer is not very well. Less than half of all parolees successfully complete their parole. This is not necessarily surprising given the fact that many parolees have trouble adjusting to life outside of prison, may not have very good support systems upon release, and have trouble finding employment with felony records. If this is the offender's first time on parole, then they have a more reasonable chance of successfully completing parole. Revolving door offenders who have been in and out of prison have a much lower chance of success. First-time offenders are hovering around the 55 to 65% rate of success, whereas re-release parolees are only between 15 and 23% rate of success. Over the years, there have been a long line of parolees being released from prison and cycling back into the system. Normally, once an individual has multiple felonies on their criminal record, the chances for parole become exceedingly less likely. There are 4 primary reasons for why an individual may be denied parole. First, if there is a substantial risk that the parolee will not conform to the conditions of parole, then the inmate will not be released. Why would we send you back into the community if we know that you're not going to do the things that you're supposed to do? It'll only be a few days or few weeks before you're revocated, and you may commit another crime while you're on the outside. We don't want anyone else to be harmed or hurt by your actions, so we're going to keep you here where we know you won't be able to harm anyone else in the community. Next, if the parolee's release would depreciate the seriousness of the crime or promote disrespect for the law, then that individual will not be released. Even though we know deterrence doesn't work, our criminal laws are built around the premise that if you receive a strong enough sentence, then other people won't commit this crime because they won't want to receive a similar sentence. Here's a good example. Even though he is now passed away, Charlie Manson's prison sentence was for life with the possibility of parole. He was originally sentenced to the death penalty, but was commutated after the death penalty became unconstitutional in 1972. Every so often, Charlie would receive a parole hearing, but was never released on parole because to do so would undermine the severity of his offenses. No parole board was ever going to release the head of the Manson family. However, he is still legally obligated to go to a parole hearing given the circumstances surrounding his sentence. Next, the parolee's release would have a substantially adverse effect on institutional discipline. For this one, if an individual was released on parole and other inmates were denied parole for something very similar, then the prison might have an uprising on their hands. They want to maintain security and peace as much as possible among their inmates, so they may not release an inmate for that reason. Finally, if the parole board believes that continued correctional treatment, medical care, or vocational or other types of training in the institution would substantially enhance the inmate's capacity to lead a law-abiding life when released, then they will deny the inmate parole until those things are completed. All right. So today's lecture was a little bit shorter, but when we talk about parole, we talk about parole at several other points in time in this semester. I didn't want this lecture to be overly redundant for it to overlap too much with the concept of probation, which is similar in structure but not in sensing formality. Remember, probation is a separate sentence, whereas parole is the continuation of the original incarceration sentence while the inmate lives in the community. Both have a variety of conditions attached to them, but they are different. Meet me back here next time when we focus on reentry efforts and what life is like when you're trying to reintegrate back into society post-incarceration. Thanks for your time and your attention, everyone, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye!